Hi class, this is Marcella again, and we're going to be discussing some parts of thinning. So kind of looking at what thinning is and also the impact of thinning on individual tree growth. So setting the stage. For simplicity, we're going to talk about the removal of all the overstory, and it's a single species stand. So going back to that example in class when we were talking about regeneration, we had some kind of disturbance. It was pretty uniform. We have this removal of the overstory, and we're going to focus on a single species stand. So disturbances, what do they usually create? Well, usually they open up growing space, but they also usually create this mosaic. So there's usually not this uniform disturbance. So this is our assumption. We're assuming a uniform disturbance. So stand replacing disturbance. After that stand replacing disturbance, we establish a cohort. And this can be done through natural regeneration. And we talked about both the positives or the advantages and disadvantages of natural regeneration. So here's an example of jack pine seedlings growing in the duck-like fire area, or they can be artificial regeneration. And this is an example of that artificial regeneration. So artificial regeneration, sometimes it's used to establish plantations. And a plantation is a stand composed primarily of trees established by planting or artificial seeding. So we have this establishment of a cohort. Our cohort is all the same age. What can we call it? We can call it even age. So what is an even age stand? What is even age? What is an even age system? What's an even age stand? So hopefully you remember an even age system, an even age stand is a stand of trees composed of a single age class in which the range of tree ages is usually 20%, plus or minus 20% of the rotation. So what is happening? What are we seeing? So we have this establishment, and in this first stage of development, we're in this A stage. So seedlings and saplings, they have room to grow. There's available growing space. And we can see in this figure, okay, so we have different ages, A, B, C, D, E, and F. We also have different spacings from very high density spacing to very lower density spacing. So we have this change in age and also a change in density. And that we see at this lowest age, at this age A, these trees are free to grow. They're expanding upward, they're expanding outward, and how long this period of free to grow really depends on the density. So we see in these lower density stands, this free to grow period extends to age B, whereas at these higher density stands, these trees are already touching, they're already competing. So here's kind of that close-up. We still see there's available growing space. So the crowns are not touching, and they're just starting to touch in this one. Whereas in this one, they're already starting to compete. So we can think about density influences how much growing space each individual tree has. So as we move through this, as we increase in age, we're growing. These trees are growing, they're expanding. They're also beginning to compete. So we see a change in the crown. We also begin to see how that density, how that competition is different here in the least dense stand. So we can see pretty good full crown compared to something over here, a very different crown. So that crown can really give us a lot of information on the level of competition that's going on in the stand. And then finally, we look at this oldest stage, F. And we see how density really influences individual tree growth. So how density changes the outcome. So we see we've grown, by F, we've grown taller, we've put on diameter, our crown has changed in this most dense stand. This is even more apparent when we look at this the most dense stand. So in the least dense stand, we see that change, but comparing that to our most dense stand, we see how much of a difference, how each individual tree in this most dense stand has so much less growing space, has so much available nutrients, water, light. They're competing for these resources at a much higher rate than the trees in this least dense stand. So what did we see? We saw density, so individual access to growing space, influences diameter and then height. And the volume growth of a tree is proportional to its crown size. So crowns can tell us a lot about a tree. So individual tree growth is greater at wider spacing. So crown closure, that last example was an example that was very uniform. However, sites are generally not necessarily that uniform. Usually there's differences. So we see in this example, there are differences. There's differences in density, there's differences in how trees are competing with each other. And I mean, we can see that. We can see I and J, they've got a good amount of space on both of their sides, but they're competing really closely in between. And we can see the difference between maybe C and D compared to tree H. We see tree H has kind of staked out. For whatever reason, it got a good spot and it's able to put on more crown. So it has, at this young age of A, it's still free to grow. There's still available growing space for it. Whereas something like C and D, they're already starting to compete with each other. And we see when these crowns touch, when they start to close, this is happening. It's not a uniform point in time. It's happening at different points in time. So we can see how at A, they're still open, and at B, the whole stand has reached crown closure. But the individual trees reach that point at different points in time. And as we move with stand age, we're seeing this kind of stem exclusion stage. So it refers to the time when the last available growing space becomes occupied and new stems are excluded. So we're seeing kind of this use of all the growing space is tied up in all these trees. So it's all tied up and new stems are being excluded. So density influences growth. What else influences growth? We talked about this a little bit in a previous lecture. So microsite, genetics, random chance. So this is the picture of my dog I was talking about the last time. So he likes to randomly eat trees, eat things in the forest when we go on walks. So what are our options? So one of the options is to let the stand proceed. So we saw in that extremely dense stand that it just keeps moving and it's not really going anywhere, and we've lost most of our crown. It's just not really doing much of anything. We can also look into our silvicultural toolbox and use a technique called thinning. So thinning is a cultural treatment made to reduce stand density of trees, primarily to improve growth, enhance forest health, or recover potential mortality. And this is part of the tending. So we are tending the stand. So we talked about those parts of a silvicultural system. So we have regeneration, tending. So thinning is a mechanism. Thinning is a tool to tend. And then finally harvesting. So, reducing stand density. What exactly are we doing by reducing stand density? So we're opening up growing space. So there's available growing space. Trees are released from competition. So we're removing what's next to them. So we're allowing those crowns to expand. So there's an increase in light, increase in crown. And what happens if the crown is under 30%? Well, it can fall over, height growth may be suppressed. And why might that height growth may be suppressed? Well, the released crown only expands as photosynthate is available for shoot growth. So there could be a period of almost catch-up. So there's only so much available. This tree only has so much available, and it's got to put some on. So there can be kind of this lag time as the tree responds to this. So we can see this example. This is again from Oliver and Larson. And if we look at kind of time A and we move through and we're hitting this wall, we're hitting this level of competition. And we see we can do types of thinning. And we're going to go through in the next lecture different types of thinning, but in this example, we'll just call them a light thinning or a heavier thinning. So we're removing some amount of the overstory, and we can see that as we remove some amount of the overstory, these trees respond. So they respond by increasing the canopy is able to expand, they're able to grow taller, they're also able to put on more diameter. And we see the level of thinning influences this crown development. So what's happening? So released trees are. So we see this example is another one, kind of looking at the mechanism of thinning. So what's it happening? So we have stand A, very open compared to stand B, very narrow spacing. So wide spacing versus narrow spacing. So as we move up, we see stand A doesn't ever get thin. So we see a difference. Whereas stand B, they begin competing, there's a thinning, and while these trees are the same height, are of a similar height, they're of a smaller diameter. Why do you think, even though these trees are the same age, why might tree stand B have a smaller diameter than the ones of stand A, even though they're similar height, age, but what impact did spacing have on them? So the reason why is because we're allocating to height before diameter. So when growing space, when resources are limited, where the tree is allocating first to this increase in height compared to increasing in diameter. So in stand A, the resources haven't been limited. So it's increasing height, it's increasing in diameter. Whereas in stand B, at this point, there's still increasing in height as much as stand A, but it's not able to put as much resources into diameter. So that's the end of this lecture. The next lecture, we're going to pick up on types of thinning. Stay tuned.